Chapter 2. When Lenard woke early the next morning and still heard the loud drumming of the rain on the roof and against the windows, he experienced feelings of both disappointment and relief. Though their mission was urgent, a day's rest would not come amiss for both him and his animals. Shadow in particular had been hard-pressed through the rugged terrain and the steep mountain passes. After a while, the feeling of relief won out, and he drifted back into welcome slumber. Hours later, he was awoken by an insistent mental nudge from Xand, who projected that he was distinctly perturbed at the thought of possibly missing the morning meal. Still yawning, Lenard got dressed in one of the 2 sets of non-military clothes he carried in his pack, then followed Xand down the broad flight of stairs. Downstairs, the common room was still full. They were obviously not the only ones who had used the enforced opportunity to sleep late. This time, Xand's entrance evoked less comment, but many eyes still followed the Lhound's progress as he and Lenard made their way across the room. Lenard sat down at a smallish table close to the fire, and Xand lay down on the floor next to him. The inner screen at a large window opposite had been slid back, and as Lenard waited to be served, he looked at the rain still streaming down the isonplex of the window panes. Again he experienced mixed feelings at the enforced delay in their journey. After placing his and Xand's order for a meal to break their fast, Lenard stood up. Out of consideration for the people in the room, he spoke to Xand aloud. "I'm just going to check on Shadow. I don't suppose you want to come with me?" Xand's only reply was a briefly sent image of a drenched Lenard being buffeted by the wind, with a faintly mocking,
"Poor, cold, wet Lenard."
He lowered a lazy head onto relaxed paws. As Lenard was settling one of the rain capes provided by the inn around his shoulders in the lobby, Anmar and Dane also walked into the room. Lenard greeted them and asked if they would like to join him and Xand for breakfast. They nodded acceptance. Both looked much less tired than the evening before, and Anmar had more colour in her face. As Lenard raised the hood of his cape, he said, "I'm just going to check on my horse. I'll be with you shortly. Not that I relish the thought of going out in that," and he tilted his head towards the door. "Our horses must also feel that we've abandoned them," Anmar said. "We'll come with you." At Dane's anguished look, she laughed and touched his arm. "You go in and order our breakfast. I'll brave the elements with Lenard." She lifted another rain cape from a hook and swung it round her. As Dane, with a look of pronounced relief, opened the door into the common room, she also raised the hood of her cape and turned towards the door. With a grimace of distaste, Lenard gripped the door handle and pulled the door open. The abrupt change in temperature and the noise of the wind and the driving rain made them both gasp with shock. Then Lenard gripped Anmar's arm, and they dashed across the courtyard to the shelter of the stables. The wide door was only sufficiently open to allow them entry. Inside, they were met with the moist warmth and pungent smells of straw, hay, and horses. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside, Lenard saw that the stables were significantly fuller than the evening before. Virtually every stall contained a horse, most contentedly munching away. As they walked further into the building, the young stable boy Lenard had met the previous evening came out of one of the stalls and wished them a cheery good morning. "Yours is the big grey, sir, isn't it?" he said to Lenard. As Lenard confirmed this, the boy turned to lead the way towards the back of the building. "I moved her to the end stall here, sir. It's a bit roomier. Your black is right next door, ma'am," he continued, looking up at Anmar. "Your brother's horse is just across from there." At the sound of their voices, all 3 horses moved to the front of their stalls. Shadow whickered gently in anticipation. As Lenard reached her, they greeted each other in their customary fashion. Shadow rested her forehead against Lenard's chest, while he stroked the sides of her face and neck with firm and soothing strokes, whilst talking to her very quietly. Next to him, Anmar was also talking to her horse. Then she walked across the passageway and gave a cheerful greeting to Dane's horse. Lenard gave Shadow a final pat, then turned to Anmar. "Introduce me," he said smilingly. She smiled in return. "Racer," she said to Dane's horse, "meet Lenard." Lenard put out a confident hand and gently stroked the big, handsome chestnut's soft nose. "He and Dane grew up together," Anmar reported. "They suit each other very well, both headstrong and full of energy, and both hate to get wet." She turned back to her horse. "This is Nightwind. She won't allow anybody but me to ride her. I think she was ill-treated as a young filly. I bought her in a very poor condition from a singularly unpleasant man when I first got to Lannetek. I think she has quite a bit of Etabrian desert thoroughbred in her." Lenard looked at the narrow, high-strung face and the large eyes that regarded him with clear antipathy. The laid-back ears imparted the same message. She doesn't like men, I'm afraid, Anmar said apologetically. Lenard just stood quietly, looking at the tense mare. He wondered if he would need Xand's help to get through to her, as he had done with Shadow in the beginning. With all his psychic energy, he tried to project a sense of calm and reassurance. Slowly, Nightwind seemed to relax. The elegant ears came forward. Then she took a step towards them, so that the broad chest pushed against the half-door. Now Lenard reached a slow hand out to her, palm upwards. She nosed at his fingers and forearm, then raised her head. Oddly, she looked at Shadow, who had moved closer, first. She gave a little snort and butted her head gently against Lenard's shoulder. Anmar watched in amazement as the mare allowed him to stroke the arched neck. All the tension seemed to have left her. The stable boy gave a low whistle. "You do have a way with horses, sir. She wouldn't let me touch her at all. Barely allowed me to give her oats and water." Lenard smiled. "It's not really me. Shadow told her I was to be trusted." With a last gentle pat of the glossy black neck, he stepped back. "I'm ready for that breakfast now." The stables had a well-run look about them, and all the horses looked cared for and content. The stable boy grinned in acknowledgement of the compliment. "I love horses, sir. If the weather is really bad, I don't even go home at night. I sleep here to make sure they are not frightened." He indicated a neatly folded bedding roll on a clean pile of straw nearby. Both Lenard and Anmar welcomed the noisy warmth of the common room after their exposure to the inclement conditions outside. The savoury repast that they were soon dedicating themselves to with single-minded attention was equally pleasant. Xand had already finished his food and was indulging in his fastidious post-feeding ritual of licking his paws and cleaning his face. As was often the case, Lenard was conscious of Xand as a muted yet comforting presence in his mind. They had both damped down their telepathic powers to an almost subliminal level, out of consideration for the non-telepaths around them. He realized that Anmar had done the same. It was therefore a little while before he realized that Xand had closed down completely. When he looked at Xand's recumbent form on the floor next to the fireplace, he realized with a faint shock that the Lhound, despite his apparent relaxation, was intently focused on something on the opposite side of the room. Following Xand's deliberately veiled gaze, he saw that the Lhound was looking at a burly, dark-haired man who was seated alone at a small table in the opposite corner. Very tentatively, he sent a low-energy "Xand" at the lionhound, but could not gain access to Xand's mind at all. He realized that Xand's mental barriers had been erected in impenetrable defense. So he spoke quietly. "Xand?" The Lhound gave him a swift look, but didn't respond. Lenard looked back at the man in the corner, merely to see his broad back disappearing through the swing doors of the common room. For a few long moments, Lenard found himself in mental limbo. Then both Anmar and Xand swept into his mind with an imperative, "We must talk now," and "Come," respectively. They both stood up hurriedly and started moving purposefully away from the table. As Lenard followed them, he saw a startled look appear on Dane's face before the young man also left the table to follow in the wake of the others. When they were all gathered in Lenard's room upstairs with the door securely bolted, Xand fairly flung himself into their minds with, "That man was a sender. He was probing all of us. He wanted to see who were telepaths in that room." "And he wanted to see how strong we were," Anmar said grimly. "He first tried to do it unobtrusively, but then, when I locked down, he tried to smash his way in. I thought he was going to split my skull just before we left the room." Lenard looked dumbfounded. "But I never felt a thing!" he exclaimed in complete bewilderment. Anmar looked at him with equal puzzlement, then said, "But Xand was shielding you. Don't tell me you didn't know. He was blocking off access to Dane as well." She seemed genuinely surprised that Lenard was unaware of this. "I think the stranger thought I was Xand's handler because he couldn't see that you were a strong telepath." Lenard fixed piercing eyes on Xand, who returned his gaze with the accustomed glint of wicked amusement in the golden depths of his eyes. "Can you do this?" Lenard demanded, and "Since when?" He was aware that his mind-send contained an aggrieved and petulant quality, but he was so taken aback that he couldn't help it. A Lhound sender of Xand's sophisticated quality and range was extremely rare. To find out that he was a shielder as well was almost unbelievable. The two qualities were supposed to be mutually exclusive. He stared at Xand with a frown knitting his forehead, unsure whether he was more delighted or outraged by the discovery. Again he caught a hint of amusement from Xand. "I only discovered it myself a few moons ago. You remember that deviant we had such problems with last year?" Lenard did indeed. The young male had been a real threat and had proved impossible to rehabilitate. In a fortunately rare occurrence, the decision had been taken to have him destroyed.
He was mind-hurting a group of trainee juveniles.
Xand continued.
Just puppies, really. I got very angry and wished that I could put a barrier between him and them. And then I somehow just did it. They calmed down immediately, and he lost interest when they didn't seem scared anymore. I do not think he even realized that I was blocking him. In any case, he was taken away the next day.
Lenard looked at Dane and Anmar rather helplessly. Both had received Xand's sending along with him, though Dane had probably only gathered the bare gist of it. Then he glared at Xand again and spoke aloud. "And why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. Virtuously, Xand replied.
I thought it was prudent to practice a bit more first.
Then he added wickedly, sly humour tinging the response.
Besides, I wanted to see how long it took you to notice something.
And then, teasingly fading out his sending, there was just the merest subliminal mind whisper of,
"A bit slow."
For a moment, Lenard tried to contain his outrage. Then, with a shout of, "You sly, conniving, dishonest, scheming wretch of a beast!" he flung himself bodily onto the Lhound. He managed to wrestle the animal to the floor and rough up his mane thoroughly before Xand pinned him to the floor with his superior weight. The effect of the Lhound's spine-chilling growl and ferocious display of lethal canines was comprehensively undermined, however, by the gusto with which he immediately proceeded to lick Lenard's face with a big, wet tongue. Lenard hugged the beast and then managed to extricate himself and scrambled to his feet after laughing and protesting vociferously. As Lenard leant into the bathing cubicle to wash his hands and face, Dane said in an awed voice, "By Grelland, I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of Xand's attentions if he was serious." Soberly drying his hands, Lenard replied, "Nobody without a very powerful death wish would." After this, a significant amount of time was expended talking and speculating about Xand's newly revealed psychic ability. Anmar was enormously impressed by the ease with which he had shielded both Dane and Lenard from the stranger's probing. She was also mystified that neither of them, particularly Lenard, had noticed that he was doing so, while she had sensed it immediately. They were all in agreement, however, that this remarkable skill of Xand's was a very useful addition to their arsenal, though they all agreed as well that this talent of Xand's should best be kept hidden at this stage. A rather smug Xand basked in all the attention.
"Xand will keep you all safe,"
he assured them, with just the faintest hint of benign condescension. After some further fruitless speculation about the stranger they had encountered downstairs, Lenard suggested that they spend the rest of the day of enforced rest in doing exactly that, resting. This sensible suggestion was greeted with swift approval by everybody, especially Xand, who suddenly managed to project an air of profound exhaustion and flopped down next to the freshly stoked fire. Lenard, who well knew the beast's almost limitless endurance, affectionately mentally labelled him a disgraceful fraud. Xand rewarded him with a brief and almost smiling gleam from the lazily closing eyes. The rest of the day passed rapidly in rest and sleep. At the final meal of the day, there was no sign of the mysterious sender. They all felt a curious sense of relief at this. With an air of marked unease, Anmar said that all she had been able to glean from her brief telepathic contact with him earlier in the day was that his mind felt dark. Xand fixed her with a piercing look.
"Very dark,"
he sent.
"And very, very strong,"
he added. For an instant the Lhound's mind seemed unusually grim to Lenard. Lenard did not know whether he was personally relieved or disappointed to have escaped contact with the stranger's mind. Dane admitted openly that he was delighted to have done so. On balance, Lenard thought he agreed with him.